Welcome. I'm excited to share with you what complex trauma is because if you're working with people who are hurting, most likely you are going to encounter someone who has complex trauma. So I'm going to describe what it is and how it can happen. I'm also going to explain the effects on the body and the brain, and I'm going to give you a few suggestions on how you may interact with someone or care for someone a little differently if you believe they have complex trauma. All right. What is complex trauma and how is it different than trauma? Well, remember, trauma is anything that overwhelms our body or our brain where we do not have the resources to cope with it. That's why you can have two different people be in the same experience, and one might experience trauma and one might not. So, complex trauma is when there is repeated or reoccurring events of trauma, reoccurring events that feel too big or too overwhelming, or I don't have the skills, or I don't have the resources, I don't have the awareness yet, maybe because I'm a little kid and my brain isn't fully developed, and I can't make sense of this environment or what is being done to me. So, some examples of reoccurring trauma, complex trauma, could be from childhood. Often that's when it starts. And so that could be neglect. It could be, did I not know if I had dinner that night? It could also be, my mom always made comments about how I looked that were demeaning or inappropriate. Or my dad corrected me every time after Little League where I didn't hit well. It could also be violence. Now, that could be violence done to the child or to the adult, or even observing violence. Because whether it's done to us or we're observing it, our brain and body processes it the same. Another example that could create some trauma, some complex trauma, is repeated bullying. What is common about all of these examples is that our brain's alarm system goes off where we don't feel safe. The thing with complex trauma versus, let's say, a one-time event trauma, like a car accident or a mugging, or sometime like when I just had one event happen versus many events happen over time, is what we see is often the way the brain becomes formed, the beliefs they have about themselves, about the world, about others, unfortunately begins to be thwarted and change. And so often we see people that have complex trauma, they often have a hard time maybe trusting themselves or their gut or having healthy relationships. Now, it doesn't mean they can't have healthy relationships. There is hope, but sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult because they haven't been safe in relationships in the past. Now, I want to explain to you how complex trauma affects the brain and the nervous system and what that looks like in relationships and in behaviors. So I'm going to do a short little lesson on the brain. So I want you to imagine that my fist is a brain. This is the brain stem. This is down in here in your neck area where things automatically happen. It's amazing. You breathe, you digest. That's all subconscious. Next, I'm going to kind of go up to this middle part of our brain. It's called our fight, flight, freeze part of our brain. It's called the amygdala, and it's our warning system. So our brain is always scanning for safety, which is amazing. God has given us brains that try to keep us safe. If you've ever been around a toddler who doesn't get what they want, what do? They feel. They might throw a tantrum, they might kick and scream. It's because this next part of the brain I'm going to describe in a second isn't even developed yet. All they have is their feelings brain. And when we've gone through complex trauma, often what happens is our feelings brain is really, really active, maybe even hyperactive. An example of that is one time I got a notice on my phone that there was an intruder in my home. Now, the phone didn't say intruder, but it did say the alarm is going off. There's been some motion inside of your house. And I looked at the little camera I have. I asked my neighbors, does it seem like there's an intruder? And it didn't seem like there was. So I looked a little bit closer, and what I saw on the camera is when the AC would turn on, a balloon would bounce on the ceiling across the room. Now, the alarm system did its job. It saw movement, it went off. However, was the balloon a threat to my home? No. And sometimes what happens with complex trauma is that middle part of our brain, the alarm system goes off that says, there's an intruder or there's not safety. Pay attention, body and brain, there's a threat. And maybe there actually is a threat. And if so, we want that part of our brain to go off. But often what happens with complex trauma is in the present, there's no longer an intruder. The alarm maybe shouldn't be going off, but it's going off because of past experiences where it wasn't safe, where there was an actual intruder. Okay, the last part of the brain we're going to talk about, this part right up here, the prefrontal cortex. Maybe you've heard of executive functioning before. It's where we have empathy and plan and prioritize and have cause and effect and all those parts of our brain that help us function well. All of these parts of the brain need to work together. And what happens often with complex trauma is something might smell, taste, look, sound like something in the past that was an intruder, and our prefrontal cortex goes offline. It's like our thinking brain isn't active because we just go, ooh, there's a threat. So how this will show up sometimes with the people you're working with is they might come in and sit with you and say, this happened, maybe something that is maybe a small or medium problem, but their emotional reaction is way up here. It doesn't seem congruent. And often with people like this, there's a lot of shame and confusion because they'll go, why is this such a big deal to me? Why do I get so angry? Why do I go from 0 to 100? Why do I feel so much shame? I just made a mistake. It's often because of the wiring of the brain. It's a little miswired. There's hope for this though, because they can heal. And our brain has plasticity and wants to heal. Just like we're broken in relationship, we heal in relationship. So now that I've given you a little lesson on the brain, hopefully you can kind of think through that lens as you're talking with people and walking them through their stories and their struggles. Be aware of if their emotional responses are really big. That might mean that there's been complex trauma and that their feelings brain is a little overreactive. And I think even sharing that information with them can cause some relief because they're like, oh, something's not wrong with me. My brain and my body has worked so hard to try to predict um, hurt and pain, and it's just a little overworked. Can actually help people feel not so much shame or that something's broken with them. The other thing with complex trauma that I see is a lot of times there's these core negative beliefs. Because if there's been repeated neglect or abuse or repeated experiences or environments that aren't safe, especially for the child, but even for the adult, they're egocentric. That means it's hard for a child to think outside of themselves. So if dad is rageful and angry, it's not because dad has a problem and needs to take responsibility and get help. It's I, as a child, must be bad. I did something wrong. I'm responsible for that. And so we often see those with complex trauma struggle with negative beliefs about themselves, about God, about those they're in relationships with. The other thing we see, I talked about kind of high emotionality. It can also go the other way, where you might feel numb or withdrawn. You might ask someone, how do you feel about that? And they'll go, nothing, whatever. I don't really feel anything. that can be a way for them to protect themselves. Because if I hold and feel in my body all the many times I've gone through trauma, it can be overbearing. And so I kind of numb out. The psychology word for this, or another way to describe this, is the word dissociation. It's when things feel too big and I can't cope with it and I kind of check out. And we all check out at different times. It's a way God has given us to be able to handle this, the hard world and difficulties. I'm sure you've driven home sometime and then you pull in your driver, like, how did I get here? Just kind of automatic. That's a sign of like a little bit of dissociation. When it can become problematic is when people aren't checking out just when they're driving, but in a conversation and they don't know what was said, they lose track of time. That can feel very confusing for someone. And that's another sign that someone's maybe been through some complex trauma. The last one is chronic pain. We know that the body, the soul, the nervous system, it's all connected. And so if we've been through repeated hard times, often our body holds that trauma and it can come out and it can try to get our attention through chronic pain. That could be headaches, stomach aches, muscle pains. So that's something to be aware of too, to help people understand that when they've gone through hard times, if they can get healing through some of the things they've been through, they may actually get some relief in their physical body as well. So I want to give you a few tips if you think that you're working with someone that has experienced complex trauma of how you might interact with them a little bit more carefully or differently. The first thing is the alliance you have with that person. Your primary goal is going to try to create an environment where they have the potential to feel safe, where they have the potential to be vulnerable. And so just like that balloon in my house that went off and set off the alarm, they're probably going to come into the room and be on somewhat high alert, even if it doesn't physically look like it. They're going to be questioning themselves. They're going to be questioning you. So your goal is to stay consistent, to have some routine if you can. So kind of do the same thing. How do you start the time you have with them? How do you end your time with them? Have it be similar? You're going to tell them what to expect. So that might even look like the first time you meet them. Tell them what your time together is going to kind of look like. If you're going to meet with them a few times, give them a heads up of what to expect. This helps that feelings brain to go, okay, I think I'm safe. I think I feel comfortable. Give them permission to share what's helpful for them or what's not. Or if they don't feel comfortable or safe, often people need to have permission that says, hey, if I say something and your body like starts to kind of race or you start to check out, let me know. I really want to be helpful and create an environment where we can start to trust one another, where you can trust me. And I know that's going to take time. And I don't expect that to happen overnight. So I want you to tell me what's helpful or what's not helpful. If they don't trust you, if you're like, man, we've met quite a few times and we're not getting too far, that can be normal with complex trauma. It's not personal. It's their body and brain trying to kind of recalibrate. Can I trust this person? Is this person going to be different than the other people in my life? I encourage you to go much slower with someone that has experienced complex trauma. What I mean by that is you may ask fewer questions. You may only talk about for a while what's happening in the present. We're not going to go dive back into their past in the first few sessions and start making connections and talking about what that was like and how it feels. We're not going to do that quite yet. They need to have skills to have their alarm system not go off before you start diving in to the trauma that they've experienced. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is they're just going to flip their lid again. Their feelings brain, their alarm system's going to go off. And it's going to almost feel like they're being re-traumatized. So go slow. Talk a little less, ask a few little less questions. You might not feel like much is being accomplished at the beginning. That's okay. The goal is possible safety and connection with this person. Okay, step two, you're also going to work on with them regulation skills. What I mean by regulation skills is that they can start to notice when their lid flips, when their thinking brain goes offline, that you can notice it, they can notice it, and they can go, oh, it's happening. Oh, do I have the skills to keep my thinking brain online? What that feels like in your body is, can I sit with someone and do I feel relaxed? Am I not too hot or too cold? Is my heart not racing? Am I not numbing out? Do I feel present in my body and present with this person? That's the goal. Many people were never taught any of that, and they're doing the best they can. So as you create safety with them, the potential for safety in the environment, as you talk with them, you're also focusing on what we call as regulation skills. Can they have some education? Can they start to identify when their thinking brain goes online and start practicing with them in person while you're talking with them? Hey, we're going to try a few skills to that, and we're going to see how your body feels. We're going to see what feels good, what feels relaxing, or maybe what feels jarring and not comfortable. So maybe we're going to do some deep breaths together. Maybe we're going to do some drawing together. Maybe we're going to kind of tighten our muscles and then we're going to slowly relax them. Maybe it's going to be as simple as we're going to put both feet on the floor and notice that. Maybe I'm going to notice the things around the room and label them. I'm going to notice any smells. I'm going to notice anything I'm touching and feeling or any taste. All those skills, all those regulation tools help our brain work in a way that goes, I'm okay, I'm safe, I can trust myself, I can trust my gut, I can trust those around me. If you can make a difference in one of those things with someone, oh, healing is on its way. It will be powerful. I want to encourage you that working with complex trauma can be challenging at times and difficult, but being patient, being consistent, letting them know that that even though their brain maybe is telling them there's a threat and that you're not going anywhere and that you're going to find them the help they need if it's outside of what you can provide for them, that will provide healing. That will begin to change the chemistry of their brain and the body.